Thank you, Stephen. We'll start here. Now, China is restricting the exports of two metals that are key to the manufacturing of semiconductor chips. Now, these new regulations imposed on grounds of national security will require exporters to seek permission for the exports of some gallium and germanium compounds starting in August. The move has escalated a technological trade war between China and the United States over the access of microchips. At the same time, the U.S. has been restricting the shipping of chips to China, forcing U.S. firms to stop supplying chips to Chinese tech firms. The battle is expected to cause supply constraints in the global chip market as mobile phone makers and car manufacturers struggle for components. To unpack this, we're now joined by Mudiwa Gavaza, who is a business writer for the Business Day and Financial Mail. Mudiwa, this particular battle is two elephants literally fighting it out on the ground. What could be the potential impact for us as consumers?
I like the fact that, you're using the analogy of elephants, because we have that common saying that says, when elephants fight, it's the grass that suffers. And unfortunately, the rest of the world is likely going to suffer when it comes to this, because the easiest thing before we even go anywhere is prices, right? Because right now, when it comes to those particular components, China is the #1 producer of those two components, and they have been keeping prices down, for those two elements to actually keep dominating in that particular market. So in the short term, it's going to depend on one of two things. Firstly, you do expect, some type of price pressure, but that will really depend on whether or not, some of the manufacturers have stockpiled these two components when it comes to, what they have, probably having learned from the chip shortage that we saw during the COVID-19 pandemic.
Now, semiconductors are needed for car manufacturing, mobile phones that we use every day, and lots of other products.
Yeah.
That particular semiconductor challenge that we had during COVID, of course, caused a lot of supply constraints around the world, which shot up prices for consumers. But why is this particular chip battle happening between the two?
Because right now, when it comes to the world, one of the next, because you always have different arms races.
Yeah.
The world, we have a history of arms races. We had something around nuclear. We had, all of that.
First on the moon.
First on the moon, all of these things. And right now, one of the big ones in the world of even AI, right, you need, those semiconductors, because those are the microchips that are driving all the technology that the world has right now. And if you think about the fact that right now, someone is watching this online on a television, you have a tablet in front of you, everything is using the chip. So right now, one of the big areas of dominance, is the fact that you need to have really good supplies of, chips for your own manufacturing, or you need to be supplying those chips or the components that make up those chips to actually be, to have that really strong seat at the table right now.
So China has a bit of an upper hand here if you look at it. When you look at the two metals we're talking about here,
yeah,
germanium and gallium, they have about 70% of the particular steel that's needed to, create some of these semiconductor chips. What the U.S. has done is try to block them off from creating the chips for AI. Who wins here? The guy who's got the natural resources, or the guy who's closing off the other components you need to complete the product?
To be honest, I think right now it's a lose-lose. Right, and I say a lose-lose because of where I started off, when elephants fight. And right now, the elephants find themselves injuring, each other, especially when you now look at the medium to long term. We wait to see how the talks actually develop over time between the two superpowers, right? Because on the one hand, China is very strong when it comes to some of the elements, some of the manufacturing, but they have been relying on international supplies when it comes to the final chips that they then use in the manufacturing, whereas the U.S. has always relied. What's interesting about the two countries is that neither of them is really the #1. When it comes to chips productions, because you think of Taiwan Semiconductor Company, TSMC, that's a Taiwanese firm. You think of Samsung, right? That's a South Korean firm,
yeah,
right? So both of them, instead of having direct control over what's there, they're trying to control the supply chain, right? And then that's how they then end up having their power. So it's a chicken and egg situation. right? Because like you said, you've got the guy that's got the elements, the guy who's got the final products, but down the line, you're hurting both sides.
We look at South Korea, China producing about 40% of the semiconductor chips that Samsung needs to make their phones. And in terms of the U.S., NVIDIA, a company that makes chips, has already been affected by the U.S. rules that have been made in terms of sending chips to China. Looking forward now into the future, like you're saying, it might be a lose-lose situation, but countries like India, where they can start having these big industries to create chips, could benefit from this particular fight.
Yes, especially countries that are able to come in with either elements or manufacturing at a cheaper price, right? That's where the real differentiator and leg up in the market is going to come from. Right now, the U.S. is investing a lot in chips manufacturing. They've been able to convince the likes of Samsung, the likes of TSMC to come in and build some of the fabs, which are basically the factories where these chips are made. However, that's going to take a bit of time to actually come online, right? You sort of need to still rely on the status quo, in the short term, which is why right now, whenever you hear this debate, people are more worried about what happens, in the current short term, because everything we're talking about, these new rules, the ones that we're talking about today, come into effect on the 1st of August. So already, in a couple of weeks, this comes into effect. So in the short term, there's that uncertainty around what happens. In the long term, China is investing in its supply chain. The U.S. is investing in its manufacturing. So on both sides, they would likely be fine, from each other. But, in this short-term period, that's where the real strain is going to be. And as consumers, we might suffer, from that point of view when it comes to pricing pressure on devices.
Another interesting race is between Build Your Dream, which is a Chinese company that builds electric cars, and Tesla as well. In fact, Build Your Dreams in China is the first vehicle producer that's beating Tesla in that particular market. But semiconductors will be needed for electric vehicles as well. Yeah. Do you foresee maybe that supply constraint even affecting the progress in that particular market?
It's an interesting one, and I'd say it's interesting on two particular points. The first one is, as much as BYD has been really good at, growing its business, there has been some tension around tech companies in China. So we've actually seen pullback from some investors. Yeah. I think the likes of Berkshire Hathaway, that they've, taken a little bit, of a backseat from those particular investments. But right now, even Tesla has been trying to ramp up, some of its own production, on that side. I would say right now the company that's in the trickiest position is probably Tesla, yeah. Simply because you are a U.S. company that's trying to grow on Chinese soil, and you are relying on components on both sides, to make things happen, whereas BYD might be a little bit better insulated. How Elon Musk is able to work around those agreements for Tesla and its manufacturing capacity in China is definitely going to be the game to watch right now.
So you'll have to play both sides of the table.
Yes.
We saw BMW announcing that 4.2 billion rand injection into South Africa to make hybrid cars here. I'm thinking about all these components we'll also be needing from these countries, whether it be the U.S. we side with or China we side with as a BRICS country. Do you think that will affect our electric making market?
It's an interesting one, and it's because you have a country-level discussion and you have a manufacturer-specific, discussion that you need to have there. So, for example, Samsung is one of the biggest chip makers in the world, right? And in South Africa, they are manufacturing 250,000, televisions in this country, which means
components are here.
The components have to come to the country. So on the one hand, you've got a Samsung that secures its own supply chain. But the trickiness then becomes, where do you find yourself, even if you have secured your supply chain? Once again, kind of like the Tesla thing we're talking about just now, to say, on a company level, you've secured your supply chain. But if you're manufacturing in a country that now faces those risks, then it becomes, a tough one. And especially with South Africa and how the spotlight is on South Africa and its relationships with the different BRICS countries.
Always finding ourselves in the middle.
It's going to be, you know, a very interesting one to watch.
All right, that was Mudiwa Gavaza, business writer for Business Day and Financial Mail, really discussing there the chip wars between China and the US and how that could play out for the rest of the world.